Saint Augustine, the Harmony of the Gospels, Book 2, Chapter 17, of the calling of the apostles as they were fishing. Matthew's narrative is continued thus. Now when Jesus had heard that John was cast into prison, he departed into Galilee. Mark states the same fact, as also does Luke, only Luke says nothing in the present section as to John being cast into prison. The evangelist John again tells us that before Jesus went into Galilee, Peter and Andrew were with him one day, and that on that occasion the former had this name, Peter, given him, while before that period he was called Simon. Likewise, John tells us that on the day following, when Jesus was now desirous of going forth into Galilee, he found Philip and said to him that he should follow him. Thus too the evangelist comes to give the narrative about Nathanael. Further, he informs us that on the third day when he was yet in Galilee, Jesus wrought the miracle of the turning of the water into wine at Cana. All these incidents are left unrecorded by the other evangelists, who continue their narratives at once with a statement of the return of Jesus into Galilee. Here, we are to understand that there was an interval here of several days, during which those incidents took place in the history of the disciples, which are inserted at this point by John. Neither is there anything contradictory here to that other passage where Matthew tells us how the Lord said to Peter, "You are Peter, and upon this rock will I build my church." But we are not to understand that was the time when he first received this name, but we are rather to suppose that this took place on the occasion when it was said to him, as John mentions, "You shall be called Cephas," which is by interpretation a stone. Thus, the Lord could address him at that later period by this very name when he said, "You are Peter," for he does not say then, "You shall be called Peter," but "You are Peter," because on a previous occasion he had already been spoken to in this manner, "You shall be called." Chapter 18. Of the date of his departure into Galilee. Furthermore, we must consider the question how the evangelist John, before there is any mention of the casting of John the Baptist into prison, tells us that Jesus went into Galilee. For after relating how he turned the water into wine at Cana of Galilee, and how he came down to Capernaum with his mother and his disciples, and how they abode there not only many days, he tells us that he went up to Jerusalem on account of the Passover. That after this he came into the land of Judea along with his disciples and tarried there with them and baptized. And then, in what follows at this point, the evangelist says, "And John also was baptizing in Ainon near to Salim, because there was much water here. And they came and were baptized." For John was not yet cast into prison. On the other hand, Matthew says, "Now when he had heard that John was cast into prison, Jesus departed into Galilee." In like manner, Mark's words are, "Now after that John was put in prison, Jesus came into Galilee." Luke again says nothing indeed about the imprisonment of John, but notwithstanding this, after his account of the baptism and temptation of Christ, he also makes a statement to the same effect with that of these other two, namely that Jesus went into Galilee. For he has connected the several parts of his narrative here in this way, and when all the temptation was ended, the devil departed from him for a reason, and Jesus returned in the power of the Spirit into Galilee. And there went out a fame of him through all the region round about. From all this, however, we may gather not that these three evangelists have made any statement opposed to the evangelist John, but only that they have left unrecorded the Lord's first advent in Galilee after his baptism, on which occasion also he turned the water into wine there. For at that period John had not yet been cast into prison. And we are also to understood that these three evangelists have introduced into the context of these narratives an account of another journey of his into Galilee, which took place after John's imprisonment, regarding which return into Galilee the evangelist John himself furnishes the following notice. When therefore Jesus knew how the Pharisees had heard that Jesus makes and baptizes more disciples than John, though Jesus himself baptized not, but his disciples, he left Judea and departed again into Galilee. So then we perceive that by that time John had been already cast into prison, and further that the Jews had heard that he was making and baptizing more disciples than John had made and baptized. Chapter 19. Of the lengthened sermon which, according to Matthew, he delivered on the mount. Now, regarding that lengthened sermon which, according to Matthew, the Lord delivered on the mount, let us at present see whether it appears that the rest of the evangelists stand in no manner of antagonism to it. Mark, it is true, has not recorded it at all. Neither has he preserved any utterances of Christ in any way resembling it, with the exception of certain sentences, which are not given connectedly, but occur here and there, and which the Lord repeated in other places. Nevertheless, he has left a space in the text of his narrative indicating the point at which we may understand this sermon to have been spoken, although it has been left unrecited. That is the place where he says, "And he was preaching in their synagogues and in all Galilee, and was casting out devils." Under the head of this preaching, in which he says, Jesus engaged in all Galilee, we may also understand that discourse to be comprehended, which was delivered on the mount, and which is detailed by Matthew. For the same Mark continues his account thus, "And there came a leper to him, beseeching him, and kneeling down to him said, If you will, you can make me clean." And he goes on with the rest of the story of the cleansing of this leper, in such a manner as to make it intelligible to us that the person in question is the very man who is mentioned by Matthew as having been healed at the time when the Lord came down from the mount after the delivery of his discourse. For this, how Matthew gives the history there, "Now when he had come down from the mountain, great multitudes followed him. And behold, there came a leper, and worshipped him, saying, Lord, if you will, you can make me clean," and so on.